Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into a story that has redefined how the world watches, creates, and experiences entertainment. You've likely spent hours, maybe even entire weekends, binging your favorite series on Netflix. From Stranger Things to The Crown, from Squid Game to House of Cards, Netflix has become a part of our cultural vocabulary. It's in our phones, on our TVs, and in the way we talk about stories. But what if I told you it all began with a $40 late fee? That's right. Before Netflix was a streaming giant with over 200 million subscribers worldwide, it was a scrappy startup with a crazy idea. What if renting movies didn't require standing in line, returning DVDs to a store, or being penalized for forgetting? This is not just a story about building a company. It's a story about breaking an industry, about turning a simple inconvenience into a billion-dollar disruption, and about how a company with no studios, no cinemas, and no traditional distribution changed Hollywood forever. From mailing DVDs in red envelopes to producing Oscar-winning films, from being laughed at by Blockbuster to watching Blockbuster vanish, Netflix didn't just adapt to the future, it created the future. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's begin the true business story of how Netflix rewrote the rules and why the revolution is far from over. The $40 late fee that started it all. Reed Hastings wasn't trying to start a revolution. In fact, in 1975, he was just trying to return a copy of Apollo 13 to his local Blockbuster, and he was late, very late. When he arrived at the store, he was met with a $40 late fee. Frustrated but intrigued, he started wondering, why did renting a movie have to come with so much friction? Hastings, a mathematician turned software entrepreneur, already had one successful exit under his belt. He'd sold his previous company, Pure Software, for hundreds of millions. But this problem, this small, annoying problem that millions of Americans faced, stuck with him. He began to talk about it with a friend and fellow entrepreneur, Mark Randolph, during their daily carpools to work. Randolph, who was deeply interested in e-commerce, had been exploring ideas in the rising world of internet business. One day, in the car, Hastings posed a simple question. What if you could rent movies online and have them delivered by mail? The idea wasn't completely new. Amazon had already shown that physical products could be ordered online and shipped to homes. But movies, videos were on VHS at the time. Big, bulky, expensive to ship. The economics didn't work. Then something changed. In early 1997, DVDs began rolling out in the US. Unlike VHS tapes, DVDs were light, thin, and cheap to mail. Suddenly, the idea had legs. Randolph ran a quick test. He mailed a CD to himself in a standard envelope, and it arrived intact. That small moment became a green light. The two got to work. With Hastings funding the venture and Randolph acting as its first CEO, they assembled a small team in Scotts Valley, California. Their mission: build the first online DVD rental service. They called it Netflix, a blend of internet and flicks. On April 14, 1998, Netflix.com went live. The original model was simple but novel. Users visited the website, browsed a small catalog of around 900 DVDs, and paid a fee to have one shipped to their home. When they were done, they mailed it back in a prepaid envelope. There were no physical stores, no return deadlines, and no late fees. It felt radical. But in reality, the early days were tough. The DVD market was still tiny. Most people didn't own a DVD player. Studios were skeptical. Investors didn't get it. And perhaps most dangerous of all, Blockbuster was massive, with over 6,000 stores and brand dominance. To compete, Netflix had to be smarter, leaner, and more creative. They soon introduced a subscription model, unlimited rentals for a flat monthly fee. This was a game changer. It eliminated the rental-by-rental mindset and built a habit. It turned passive customers into engaged subscribers. To improve the experience, they developed something even more powerful: the queue. Customers could build a personal list of movies they'd like to see, and Netflix would automatically send the next available title when one was returned. Over time, they added ratings, recommendations, and early forms of personalization, all built around a growing library and user behavior data. This approach, combining technology with convenience, became the DNA of Netflix. But even with innovation, growth was slow. The dot-com bubble was building, competition was rising, and Netflix was burning cash fast. Blockbuster still towered over the market. Studios still played favorites. Some wondered if Netflix would survive long enough to matter. What kept them going? A belief, stubborn, maybe even naive, that people hated late fees, hated driving to stores, and that one day everyone would rent entertainment online. What started with a late fee was starting to look like the early warning sign of a dying business model. Netflix wasn't just renting movies. It was setting the stage for a showdown that would define the next 2 decades of entertainment. Beating Blockbuster, the David Belight Ohalam. By the year 2000, Netflix was surviving, but barely. Despite the promise of its subscription model and the growing buzz around DVDs, the company was still burning through cash and struggling to scale. Blockbuster, meanwhile, remained the undisputed giant of home entertainment. With over 60,500 physical stores, tens of millions of loyal customers, and an instantly recognizable brand, Blockbuster had become synonymous with movie nights across America. Its bright blue and yellow signage was a fixture in suburbs nationwide. For most consumers, renting a movie still meant getting in the car and going to Blockbuster. Netflix was the opposite, small, relatively unknown, and digital-first in a world that hadn't fully embraced the internet. But Reed Hastings, now CEO of Netflix, knew something Blockbuster didn't. He understood how fragile dominance could be when consumer behavior starts to shift. And Netflix was slowly proving a hypothesis. If given a better option, customers would absolutely ditch the old model. Still, by mid-2000, Netflix was running out of money. The dot-com bubble had burst. Investors were skeptical, and DVDs, while growing in popularity, were still far from mainstream. Hastings and his team made a bold and now legendary move. They flew to Blockbuster's headquarters in Dallas and pitched an idea. Let's join forces. Netflix proposed becoming the online division of Blockbuster. For $50 million, Blockbuster could acquire the entire company, tech, brand, customer base, and future. The response? They laughed. Blockbuster executives reportedly didn't see the point. DVDs were still just a small fraction of the rental market. The internet was unstable. Netflix, in their view, was a niche player, an experiment at best. They turned down the deal. That moment, dismissed as a minor meeting at the time, would go down as one of the greatest missed opportunities in corporate history. So, Netflix went back to work, humbled but energized. They doubled down on what they did best: customer experience, personalization, and flexibility. They refined their subscription model, improved logistics, and invested heavily in data-driven recommendations, which began setting them apart from any traditional rental service. Netflix became obsessed with predicting what people wanted to watch next, not by hiring tastemakers, but by letting the audience's own behavior tell the story. Every rating, every rental, every queue placement became data that helped improve the algorithm. Over time, Netflix developed a recommendation engine so accurate that it started driving a significant percentage of rentals. Meanwhile, Blockbuster, still clinging to its in-store experience, started to show cracks. The company was highly profitable, but most of those profits came from late fees, a pain point Netflix had completely eliminated. Customers were beginning to resent the rigid rules, and competitors like Redbox and Amazon were eyeing the same space. In 2004, Blockbuster finally responded. They launched their own DVD by mail service, mirroring Netflix's model almost exactly. But it was too late. Netflix had a multi-year head start, a more sophisticated tech stack, and most importantly, customer loyalty. Blockbuster also struggled internally. Its executives were stuck between competing goals: protect the profitable retail business or invest heavily in digital, which was still unproven. That indecision cost them time, and time was Netflix's greatest ally. In 2005, Netflix passed a milestone. Over 4 million subscribers, their revenue was growing steadily, customer retention was improving, and their brand, once obscure, was becoming a verb. I'm gonna Netflix something tonight. Blockbuster, burdened by leases, debt, and a lack of digital culture, couldn't pivot fast enough. The David versus Goliath battle was quietly tilting in favor of David. But Netflix knew the war wasn't won yet. DVDs were only a stepping stone. The future, they believed, wasn't in the mailbox. It was in the stream. And that meant they'd have to risk everything. Again. The streaming gamble, betting the company on the future, 2007 to 2012. By 2007, Netflix had done the impossible. It had survived the dot-com bust, outmaneuvered Blockbuster, and reached over 6 million subscribers in the United States. DVDs by mail were no longer a fringe idea. They were a dominant force. Netflix had become the new normal. But Reed Hastings wasn't satisfied. In fact, he was already thinking about something that would make DVDs look obsolete. He saw a future not built on envelopes and shipping centers, but on speed, convenience, and instant gratification. He saw a world where movies didn't arrive in the mailbox days later, but streamed instantly to your screen. The internet, though still imperfect in 2007, was catching up. Broadband access was spreading fast. YouTube was exploding in popularity. Hulu had just launched. The pieces of the streaming future were falling into place, so Netflix made a bold decision. Start building a streaming platform, right now. The idea was risky. DVDs still made up 100% of their revenue. Streaming was untested. Licensing content from studios was expensive, and the catalog would be limited at first. But Hastings believed that if they didn't move, someone else would, and Netflix would go the way of Blockbuster. In January 2007, Netflix quietly introduced a new feature called Watch Instantly. It allowed users to stream a small selection of movies and TV shows directly to their computer. No disc required. The catalog was tiny. The quality was decent at best. But it worked. And more importantly, it hinted at something bigger. Internally, the company knew this was no side project. It was a pivot, a bet on the future. But the real shift came with a far more radical idea. One day, Netflix would stop renting DVDs altogether. That vision terrified some investors and even employees. Netflix's core strength was logistics, warehouses, shipping efficiency, customer support. But Hastings believed that those physical assets, so critical to Netflix's rise, would one day become its weakness. To prepare, Netflix began investing aggressively in its streaming tech stack. It negotiated hard with studios to license content, many of which still didn't fully understand what streaming meant. It optimized its platform for early devices: laptops, Xbox, PlayStation, and eventually smart TVs. Netflix was pushing into a new frontier and dragging the industry with it. Then came the Quickster debacle. In 2011, Netflix announced it was splitting its business into two separate entities, one for DVDs, called Quickster, and one for streaming, still called Netflix. Users would need 2 accounts, 2 bills, 2 websites. The response was disastrous. Customers were confused and angry. The press pounced. Subscriptions plummeted. Netflix's stock lost nearly 75% of its value in just a few months. Reed Hastings publicly apologized and walked back the decision. Quickster was killed before it even launched. For a moment, it looked like Netflix had overreached. Too much change, too fast. But here's what most people missed. Even though the Quickster idea failed, the streaming vision did not. In fact, Netflix continued expanding its streaming library while letting its DVD business quietly fade into the background. The Quickster crisis served as an expensive, painful lesson, but also a signal that Netflix had fully committed to digital. By 2012, something extraordinary had happened. Streaming had overtaken DVD as the primary driver of Netflix's business. The company had more than 20 million subscribers, many of whom never rented a single disc. And Netflix wasn't just delivering content anymore. It was shaping how content was delivered. Blockbuster was gone. Competitors were confused, and Netflix, it was just getting started. Because now, having disrupted how people watched movies, Netflix was about to disrupt what they watched too. Original content, the house that built a studio. Netflix had proven it could do more than ship DVDs. It had survived the Quickster debacle, transitioned the majority of its user base to streaming, and secured a place in the digital living rooms of millions of households. But something still wasn't right. Netflix had become dependent on other people's content. Studios licensed shows and films, but always with caution, and often temporarily. Netflix built its early streaming success on reruns: Friends, The Office, Breaking Bad. But as streaming grew, traditional media companies started to see Netflix not as a partner, but as a threat. Licensing became expensive, restrictions tightened, content came and went too quickly. Reed Hastings and his team realized they were building a castle on land they didn't own. So they made a decision that would redefine the future of the company, and arguably the future of entertainment. Netflix would become a studio, not just a distributor, not just a tech platform, a full-fledged world-class content creator. The move began with a political drama no one was quite sure would work, House of Cards. Premiering in February 2013, House of Cards was a seismic shift. It wasn't just a new show, it was a statement of intent. Netflix didn't just acquire the series, it commissioned it, produced it, released it all at once, inviting users to binge-watch the entire season from day one. It flipped the traditional TV model on its head. No pilot season, no weekly rollout, no ad breaks, just great storytelling, world-class talent, and data-driven creative risk. And it worked. Viewership exploded, critics raved. The show earned Emmy nominations, shattering the notion that online series were somehow less real than television. Suddenly, Hollywood realized something chilling. Netflix wasn't just streaming content. It was becoming Hollywood. Flush with confidence, Netflix went all in. It greenlit more originals, Orange is the New Black, Narcos, BoJack Horseman, Daredevil. Some were hits, others flopped. But Netflix didn't play by traditional studio rules. It didn't need overnight ratings or ad revenue. It measured success by engagement, how often viewers finished a series, how it retained subscribers, how it drove word of mouth. Behind the scenes, Netflix's true power came from its algorithms. The company didn't just guess what people wanted. It used terabytes of viewing data to understand patterns, moods, genres, and preferences. It didn't just know you liked crime dramas. It knew you liked dark crime dramas with morally gray anti-heroes in small towns. This led to better targeting, smarter programming, and an ability to greenlight shows others might pass on, because Netflix could see the audience before the story even aired. And then, in 2016, came a show that proved just how powerful that approach could be. Stranger Things. Created by the little-known Duffer Brothers, Stranger Things was a retro sci-fi mystery that pulled from Stephen King, Spielberg, and 1980s nostalgia. On paper, it was a creative risk, but to Netflix, it was a calculated one, based on clear signals from its data and a belief in the creator's vision. The show became a global phenomenon almost overnight. Memes, merchandise, Halloween costumes, fan theories, even a surge in interest for Eggo waffles. Stranger Things wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural event. From that point on, the floodgates opened. Netflix began producing hundreds of original titles per year. It expanded into stand-up comedy, documentaries, international content, and even kids programming. Its budget skyrocketed into the billions as it committed to being the world's biggest studio. And then came the awards. The Crown, Roma, The Irishman, Marriage Story. Netflix began not only dominating the conversation, but earning Oscars, Emmys, Golden Globes. It had moved from outsider to elite, from disruptor to establishment. By 2018, Netflix was spending more on original content than most legacy studios. And here was the twist. Traditional studios had helped build Netflix by licensing their content during the streaming startup years. But now, seeing the threat, they began pulling their catalogs back to launch their own platforms. Disney+, HBO Max, Peacock. It didn't matter. Netflix had already outgrown dependency. It had built its own creative engine, one powered by viewer behavior, guided by experimentation, and free from the constraints of ad breaks and time slots. Netflix no longer needed Hollywood. In many ways, it had become Hollywood. The global giant expansion, competitors, and COVID. Netflix was no longer just a streaming platform. It was a global content powerhouse. With over 130 million subscribers spanning North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia, the company had become one of the most influential forces in modern entertainment and one of the most feared. The platform had evolved into something unprecedented. A studio, a distributor, a tech company, and a brand, all rolled into one. It wasn't just creating content. It was shaping tastes, habits, and entire cultures. But with success came new challenges. As Netflix's rise continued, the legacy media giants, once hesitant to enter streaming, could no longer ignore the writing on the wall. They had licensed their content to Netflix for years, feeding the very beast that now threatened them. That ended now. One by one, major studios pulled their libraries back. Warner Media reclaimed Friends and The Office to bolster HBO Max. Disney withdrew Marvel, Star Wars, and Pixar content to launch Disney+. NBC Universal created Peacock. Even Apple joined the game with Apple TV+. The streaming wars had begun. Netflix was no longer alone. It was now the incumbent and the target. But instead of panicking, Netflix leaned into its biggest advantage. It didn't just license content, it made it. And it had already started going global years earlier. From its streaming base in the US, Netflix had quietly expanded into over 190 countries. But rather than simply translating American shows, the company doubled down on locally produced, culturally relevant original content for local and global audiences alike. The results were extraordinary. In Spain, La Casa de Papel, Money Heist, became a global sensation, topping charts in non-Spanish-speaking countries. In Germany, Dark proved a sci-fi hit that pulled in viewers from the US to Brazil. In France, Lupin turned into an instant blockbuster. In India, Netflix invested heavily in gritty dramas and Bollywood-adjacent storytelling. And then, in 2021, came the big one. From South Korea, where Netflix had invested over $500 million in local content, emerged a small, strange, and violent survival drama, Squid Game. Nobody saw it coming. In a matter of days, Squid Game exploded across the globe. It topped the charts in over 90 countries, dominated social media, spawned Halloween costumes, TikTok trends, and academic debates. It became the most-watched Netflix series of all time, over 1.6 billion viewing hours in its first month. The message was clear. Global audiences weren't just ready for foreign content. They craved it. Netflix's localization strategy had turned into a global cultural movement. But just as Netflix reached unprecedented heights, the world changed. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe. Schools closed, cities shut down, theaters went dark, and billions of people were suddenly stuck at home, hungry for distraction, escape, and connection. It was a strange kind of boom for Netflix. As physical production halted for competitors, Netflix, with its massive content pipeline already in motion, surged ahead. Subscriptions soared, stock prices skyrocketed, families gathered to watch The Queen's Gambit, Tiger King, Bridgerton. Entire cultural moments were now unfolding on screen, powered by Netflix. But the pandemic also brought new pressure. With the acceleration of streaming adoption came a compression of the market. Disney Plus gained 100 million subscribers in just 16 months. HBO Max launched exclusive blockbusters online. Amazon acquired MGM. The battlefield was getting crowded and expensive. Netflix found itself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in its history, it wasn't the scrappy underdog. It was the giant everyone else was chasing. By 2022, the signs of strain started to show. Growth began to slow. In Q1 of 2022, Netflix reported its first subscriber loss in over a decade. Wall Street panicked. The company's stock plummeted. The media, once in awe, questioned whether Netflix had peaked. But Netflix had seen this before. The company knew disruption came in waves, and it had always survived by adapting before anyone else dared. So, they adjusted. They rolled out lower-cost ad-supported plans, ending their long-standing resistance to advertising. They cracked down on password sharing, a practice once tolerated to boost reach. They invested more in games, interactive stories, and new genres. The mission hadn't changed, but the market had. To survive the next era, Netflix wouldn't just have to be a great streamer. It would have to redefine what streaming even meant. Reinventing entertainment, the future of Netflix. For a company that started with mailing DVDs in red envelopes, Netflix has already lived several lifetimes. It disrupted video rental, then disrupted television, then challenged the entire structure of the entertainment industry. Along the way, it became a studio, a tech innovator, a global platform, and most recently, a symbol of the streaming age. But by 2022, one thing had become clear. Even disruptors eventually face disruption. Netflix, now a giant among giants, could no longer rely on novelty. Streaming was no longer a revolution. It was the norm. Everyone was streaming. Everyone had a platform. And the once untouchable Netflix had to fight harder than ever for attention, loyalty, and innovation. So what does a company do when it has conquered the market it helped create? It reinvents itself. Again. In recent years, Netflix has taken bold steps into new territories. One of the most significant, gaming. In 2021, Netflix began quietly rolling out mobile games on its app, starting with titles based on its own IP, like Stranger Things. The move puzzled some observers. Why would a streaming company venture into gaming? But for Netflix, the reasoning was simple: time and attention. People weren't just choosing between shows anymore. They were choosing between YouTube, TikTok, podcasts, video games, and endless notifications. Entertainment was no longer about what to watch. It was about what to do. And if Netflix wanted to stay relevant, it had to become interactive. This wasn't new ground for the company. Back in 2018, Netflix had released Bandersnatch, a choose-your-own-adventure film set in the Black Mirror universe. The experience let viewers make decisions that changed the story in real time. It wasn't just watched, it was played. The experiment was a hit, and more followed: You vs. Wild, Minecraft Story Mode, and interactive kids shows. Now Netflix was expanding that thinking into fully fledged gaming, hiring top developers, building internal studios, and acquiring indie game companies. But games were just one part of the puzzle. Netflix was also investing in franchise building. For years it had churned out standalone hits, but now it wanted universes. Franchises like The Witcher, Extraction, The Gray Man, and Squid Game were being developed with sequels, spin-offs, merchandise, and long-term world-building in mind. The goal? To create evergreen ecosystems of content that lived beyond a single season. And yet, innovation wasn't enough. To remain a cultural leader, Netflix had to rethink its business model too. For over a decade, the company proudly rejected advertising. It positioned itself as an alternative to the noise of cable TV, but rising competition and economic pressure forced a rethink. In 2022, Netflix launched its first ad-supported tier, a dramatic shift in philosophy. Simultaneously, it began cracking down on password sharing, something it had once joked about in tweets. But now, with growth slowing in mature markets, the company needed to tighten its ecosystem and turn casual users into paying subscribers. These changes weren't just about revenue. They were about evolving with the market, staying one step ahead, even if that meant breaking old rules. And all the while, Netflix continued to double down on what had always been its secret weapon: data. Every click, every pause, every binge watch feeds into an ecosystem of insight. Netflix doesn't just know what people watch. It knows how they watch, when they watch, what makes them stop, and what makes them stay. This data doesn't just inform recommendations. It shapes casting decisions, release schedules, even creative direction. Some see it as mechanical, others see it as brilliant. But in truth, Netflix's use of data has allowed it to do something no traditional studio ever could: create at global scale with local precision. And perhaps that's what Netflix truly is now: a global, algorithm-driven, culture-making machine. From Nigeria to Brazil, South Korea to Poland, Netflix is producing content in dozens of languages with local talent for local audiences, and then exporting that content to the rest of the world. It's not just importing culture, it's amplifying it. So, what comes next? No one knows for sure, not even Reed Hastings, who stepped down as CEO in 2023, handing leadership to a new generation. But if history has shown anything, it's that Netflix doesn't wait for the future. It builds it. In the end, the story of Netflix is not just about movies or shows. It's about a company that kept asking the same question again and again: what if we did it differently? That question turned a late fee into a billion-dollar idea. It turned a website into a studio. It turned passive viewers into binge watchers. And it turned a startup into a global empire. But the story isn't finished. Because in entertainment, like in business, the next revolution is always just one crazy idea away.